Sometimes movies arrive in theaters to the sound of a sad trombone. They stink up the joint for a while and then they slink away in shame. So the next time you're having an off day at your job, just be glad the results don't get released to thousands of screens worldwide. 2004's The Grudge was one of the more well-regarded films of the wave of American remakes of Japanese horror films that we saw in that decade. Unfortunately, Hollywood studios are apparently thinking that now is the time to start rebooting all those remakes. Or they did, until the 2020 edition of The Grudge crashed and burned hard enough to give them second thoughts about revisiting this particular franchise. It's had a promising pedigree, with Nicholas Pesce, the filmmaker who broke out with 2016's The Eyes of My Mother, writing and directing, and a cast that included John Cho, Betty Gilpin, and horror legend Lin Shaye. What it didn't have was an original plot, a consistent tone, or any real scares.
I'm scared. I'm scared too.
Paul Whittington of The Independent was one of the many critics to bemoan the seeming lack of effort put into the film, writing, "This is shoddy stuff, full of J-horror cliches and supposed jump scares you can see coming a mile off. It's not particularly frightening, but it sure is depressing." Virtually every critic acknowledged the solid awesomeness of the cast, but the fact that The Grudge squandered their talent only gave reviewers another reason to trash the flick. The sad fact is that when there are already two other better versions of this movie out there that still hold up as icons of their era, this remake isn't just bad on its own merits, it's pointless too. Like a Boss was another film that utterly failed to capitalize on the considerable talent of its cast. On paper, the roster of talent assembled for this mess is phenomenal, with Salma Hayek, Billy Porter, Rose Byrne, and Tiffany Haddish, who seemingly cannot catch a break when it comes to her cinematic outings.
Don't hate me, hate Mel, it was her idea.
What?
Byrne and Haddish star as a pair of up-and-coming businesswomen whose friendship is put to the test when their small cosmetics company is bought up by a corporation. It's a classic comedy setup, and this 83-minute groaner made feeble stabs at both subversive laughs and a #girlboss female empowerment vibe, neither of which worked. Vulture's Alison Wilmore put it best in her review, where she asked the same question that everyone in the movie's meager audience was left wondering. How do you make a movie with this cast and have it be so devoid of joy? It feels like a film whose point is clumsily misunderstood by the very people who created it. That's brutal, but accurate, and Wilmore wasn't alone. Peter Travers, the resident film critic at Rolling Stone, rated the film at 1 out of 5 stars and called it, quote, "a comedy on life support. Sorry to report, the patient died." He is hoping Haddish, Byrne, and the rest of this talented cast get a better opportunity to show off their considerable talent in the future. After being the face of the most popular franchise in the world and getting the most heroic death in recent memory at the climax of Avengers Endgame, Robert Downey Jr. was probably in the rare position of being able to follow his 11-year tenure as Iron Man with pretty much any project he wanted to. Apparently, what he wanted to do was star in Dolittle, a retelling of a classic story that baffled critics and required Downey to sport one of the most impenetrable accents in film history.
It's a nightmare!
The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw took a particular dislike of Downey's garbled dialogue delivery, writing, "It really is horribly inert, and every time Downey opens his mouth to say something unintelligible, the film dies a bit more."
Enemy! Starboard aft! Elliot, you and Etsy, ready the machine! We're gonna need speed! Send out the call!
The film's oddly slapdash quality, troubled production, and poor special effects were called out by a lot of reviewers. But the fact is, this thing could have looked like Avatar and still have been a disaster. More than one critic regarded Downey's performance as a career worst, which is saying something when you consider that he's had 40 years of starring roles leading up to it. That said, it appears that there was little that Downey could have done to save a movie that was simply ill-conceived and poorly executed, but hey. Following up a critically acclaimed movie that virtually everyone in the world saw with a universally hated flop that nobody wanted is certainly a bold move. When it was pitched, The Turning almost certainly seemed like a great idea. It's an adaptation of the classic Henry James novel The Turn of the Screw, directed by visionary filmmaker Floria Sigismondi, whose recent work includes critically acclaimed prestige TV like The Handmaid's Tale, Runaways, and American Gods, along with dozens of music videos. The cast was stacked with stars Mackenzie Davis of Terminator Dark Fate, breakout Stranger Things star Finn Wolfhard, and Jolie Richardson, fresh from a role in 2018's stylish spy thriller Red Sparrow. If that wasn't enough, it was produced by a guy you might have heard of called Steven Spielberg.
Can I help you?
With all that talent, it was bound to be stylish, and most critics agreed that it was. They also agreed that it was confusing, boring, and flat-out bad.
Well, I hope you know what you're doing.
Those obviously weren't the descriptors that the cast and crew and company were going for. And they got worse. David Nussar of Real Film Reviews called The Turning, quote, "an absolutely abhorrent ghost story, an excessively deliberate drama that's almost entirely devoid of dread and atmosphere, an almost uncommonly intolerable contemporary horror flick." There was plenty of praise for the actors, with more than one observer noting the project's wasted potential, but quite a few others simply deemed the film a waste. It was especially disappointing from a filmmaker with a stellar track record like Spielberg's. Jamie East of The Sun might have put it best and most brutally, writing, "That the man who gave us Jaws and Poltergeist had even a smidgen of a hand in this relentlessly dull barrage of cheap tricks is beyond me. Utterly ridiculous and not worth your time." Recycling the premise of the classic campy 70s television series Fantasy Island, in which guests to a mysterious resort run by an enigmatic figure have their wildest dreams come true, into a Blumhouse horror thriller was definitely a weird idea, but not the worst one we've ever seen. Sure, the series ended before most of the movie's target audience was even born and was never that well loved in reruns, but the setup could certainly lend itself to scares, and casting Michael Pena in the Mr. Rourke role was nothing short of inspired. Unfortunately, the flick from writer-director Jeff Wadlow didn't just botch the adaptation.
I don't know how to tell you this, boss. I don't know what to say.
As Real View's James Bernardelli put it, Fantasy Island 2020 made the campy, cheesy 70s TV original, quote, seem smart and fresh by comparison.
Painfully unimaginative.
Fantasy Island was one of the most brutally reviewed movies of the year. Critics called it convoluted, haphazard, and stupid, and those were the kind of reviews. The weak story drew complaints that it was an absolute drag of a morality tale without the morality that swapped out all the 70s cliches of the original for equally cliche modern horror tropes. A revival of an old TV property that nobody was actually asking for can go very right sometimes. Just check out the woefully underrated 2015 Man from U.N.C.L.E. for proof. This particular fantasy, on the other hand, was more like a nightmare, and not in the fun, scary way that it should have been. 2016's The Boy was an interesting horror effort, and one that wasn't really asking for a sequel until the scares were over. It was ostensibly the story of a killer doll who jealously guards the house in which it lives, where parents whose young son tragically dies years earlier hire a nanny to take care of their not-so-inanimate boy. The flick's shocking final twist was one of the more well-done in recent years, so leave it to its sequel, Brahms The Boy 2, to essentially undo it in the service of a far inferior movie. In the words of LeVar Burton, you don't have to take our word for it. Critic William Bibani wrote in the wrap that the movie swerves so hard from the good parts of the first film that, quote, it practically leaves skid marks on the screen. Many critics weren't even that kind, such as Benjamin Lee, who wrote in The Guardian that, quote, there's something willfully unscary about The Boy 2, as if director William Brent Bell is trying to prove a point, shining a light on the sheer pointlessness of this kind of by-the-numbers genre trash. He also blasted the film for being so barren of originality that it pulled off the actually pretty impressive feat of making an 86-minute horror film seem like an unbearably stale snooze. Yeesh. On the bright side, with as bad as this movie was received, it's pretty easy to guess that the creepy doll's greatest victim was the chances of getting any more sequels. A movie centered on Jesus Quintana from The Big Lebowski sure sounded like an interesting idea. Star John Turturro obviously thought so, considering that he poured a lot of persistence and a couple decades into getting the character into the spotlight with his own film, 2020's The Jesus Rolls, which he wrote, directed, and starred in.
Quintana. That creep can roll, man.
Unfortunately, the film leaned hard into the most cartoonish aspects of the character, and away from the little things that made the Coen brothers Lebowski a classic. Things like nuanced humor, a solid plot, and dialogue that sounds like it could be spoken by actual humans. Brian Tallarico of RogerEbert.com channeled his site's namesake, calling the film uninteresting and writing, it turns out that the main lesson here is that Jesus Quintana shouldn't be going places outside of the bowling alley. Other reviews were equally harsh, taking aim at the lazy comedy of the screenplay and the lack of originality, and then went on to rack up 10 frames worth of bowling puns. Flick Feast critic Franco Cheng went particularly hard on that front, leaving nothing to spare as he framed up all the strikes against the cinematic turkey. The Jesus Rolls throws a gutter ball down the farcical greasy lane, in an unimaginative sex buddy road flick where the thin-layered juvenile raunchiness is a strikeout of the unwanted kind. Doing a spin-off of one of the most beloved cult classics of all time after a full 22 years of anticipation was probably doomed from the start, but the Jesus Rolls would have been bad no matter when it came out. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more Looper videos about your favorite movies and TV shows are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.